Prime Minister, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. I'd like to begin by asking you how you first found out about the Grenfell fire tragedy and how did that make you feel?
Yes, well, I first found out that morning, sort of first thing that morning. And obviously when I got into the office, I was seeing the pictures on the television screens. And it was obvious that this was an awful tragedy that had taken place. Of course, during that day, exactly the depth of that tragedy started to unfold. Of course, as we started to see hear social media, see the other pictures, and realise what an absolutely horrific experience it had been for everybody who was involved in it.
The first few days after the fire, there was a lot of tension in the community. People felt that they had been abandoned and they were rightly angry. How did it feel visiting the North Kensington community the first few days after the fire?
Yes, well, I visited, of course, a couple of days after the fire, but I visited. Actually, that time I came down to see the firefighters, the police, all those who'd been involved in that emergency services response, to thank them for what they've been doing, but to hear from them directly. I think it was when I actually came to the site and saw the tower and heard directly from the firefighters that I realised how absolutely shocking. I mean, it was really shocking to see that building. And I began to hear more of the stories, more of the explanation of the absolute horror that people had gone through, and started to understand more the depth of the tragedy. I didn't, of course, on that first visit, meet members of the community or survivors. And I'm sorry for not having met them then. I regret that, because I think people perhaps felt that they wanted those of us in power to know that we had understood and recognised what had happened, and perhaps felt that not meeting them immediately meant that I didn't care, and that was never the case. And when I subsequently met victims in hospital and met survivors and residents and talked to them about their experience over those following few days, I was struck by the dignity which they showed in the face of what had been something that had been life-changing for them, and they had lost loved ones. They'd lost all their possessions, many of them, and just a truly horrific experience.
Why do you think it took so long for the authorities to respond to such a tragic event?
Well, the response wasn't good enough. That's absolutely clear from the beginning, and that's what, as government, we've been trying to ensure that the response improved, which I think it did over time, but I don't know why it took so long. I think that one of the messages that came to me from local residents when I talked to them was that actually, when we looked at the response from the council in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, that this wasn't the first time that they felt the council hadn't responded to their needs, that over the years they'd felt that they'd been talking to the council about things like the safety of the tower and just not getting any response. And I think that the council did improve their response, but there's no doubt, again, when I was talking to people later, some weeks after the tragedy, that they felt, even on something like the approach the council was taking in talking to them about their housing needs, there was a lack of sensitivity there, and a lack perhaps of full understanding of exactly what people had gone through.
What has been the hardest part of dealing with the Grenfell tragedy?
I think one of the hardest things is, of course, when you hear the depth of what has happened to people, and the stories about how people's lives have just been completely upended. I remember in the days after the tragedy, when I first visited some victims in hospital, I met a couple who had fled from their flat. They'd fled from their flat. Others had been in their flat and sadly died. They'd fled from the flat, and the woman said she just left basically in t-shirt and knickers. That was all she had, and all her possessions were gone. People of course lost loved ones, but they lost their whole life. They lost their treasured memories. I think it's the hardest thing for people will be actually rebuilding their lives when they have lost so much. From government's point of view, the important thing for us to do has been to be working with the council and just trying constantly to make sure that the support that is needed is there, understanding and recognising that that support for example, mental health support, needs to be there not just now, 1 year on, it needs to be there in the future for people who need it.
Prime Minister, I know you've met with many of the bereaved families and survivors. What do you say to somebody who's lost everything?
What an appalling tragedy it is, and how sorry I am. Sorry that their life has been affected in this way. And also that I think it's important for us not only that we make sure they have the support they need, but also that we make sure we find out why it happened, so that they can get to the truth. And that, of course, is where the inquiry comes in, and any criminal investigations that take place. It's about trying to give people, sometimes, people use this phrase, closure. I don't think there's ever closure. If you've lost, somebody who's been your husband or wife for years, if you've lost all your possessions, if you're having to move into a new home and rebuild your life, I don't think there's ever closure. But what I hope we can give people is the truth, so that they know why this happened. Of course, we want to learn lessons to ensure it can never happen to others in the future.
Some people think that you as Prime Minister are out of touch with communities like ours. We're a hard-working, diverse bunch of people who live in social housing. Some of us live in social housing. What is your point of reference when trying to understand the challenges that communities like ours face?
I would say my point of reference, first of all, is to try to listen to communities, and for us as a government to listen to communities. That's why when I met residents and survivors of the Grenfell Tower tragedy and heard from them how they felt that the council had not been listening to them over the years, and we then had that reflected in some other parts of London as well. That's why I asked the housing minister to actually go out to talk to people in social housing, to hear, and they've met thousands of people, to hear what people's experience is, so that we can say, actually, this isn't just about providing somebody with a building with rooms in which to live. It's about ensuring that people really feel that they are being listened to, that their concerns are being taken into account. And listening to some of the stories that I've heard makes it very clear to me that we haven't been good enough at that, and we need to be, because we're all one community. We're all part of one society and one big community.
One of the biggest concerns for the bereaved and families is fire safety. How will you make sure that this never happens again and that people who live in tower blocks feel safe in their homes?
Obviously, immediately after the fire, we took some steps in relation to tower blocks, looking at the cladding, getting samples sent in from other tower blocks to test it. And the results of those tests were pretty shocking. We've had a review. Dame Judith Hackett has done a review of the fire regulations and building regulations, and the government is taking action specifically to look at this issue of cladding, which has been so important to people. But also, of course, so having set up the inquiry, the judge-led inquiry, the aim of that is to identify, if you like, all aspects of what happened here and what went wrong, so that we can learn lessons from it. Obviously, what we do with fire regulations, with building regulations in future is important, a key element, but also how we ensure that when people raise concerns about safety in their buildings, those are listened to and acted on is also important.
A year on from the Grenfell fire, there's a lot of mistrust between the authorities and the local community, and that's still quite raw. How do we begin to mend the fractures between the community and authorities? And in particular, how would you like to be remembered for the Grenfell tragedy by this community?
In relation to the relationship between the community and the authorities, I think it's important both at local council level and at government level that we do all we can to be alongside the community and be listening to them. And I hope that will build up trust. But I recognise that over the years, trust between people and the authorities had broken down. And it takes a lot to reinstate that trust before people really feel reassured. And I recognise that, and we need to keep working at that. I've as you will know, at an early stage, asked one of my government ministers to take responsibility for working with the community. Nick Hurd has been doing this and has, I think, been spending a lot of time listening to people, hearing their both individual cases, individual concerns, but also meeting with the community generally. I've met with different groups from the community as well, with Grenfell United. A group was brought in to see me with the local MP. I've met a group of women survivors who had a particular set of issues they wanted to raise with me. I think that constant working with the community is important. And I hope that people will be able to look back and say that we've enabled people to find the truth. And we did give them, it took too long, but we did give them the support that they needed. And we want to continue to listen to people to make sure that we are doing just that.
If the criminal investigation finds that there are indeed people who are responsible through either neglect, indifference or greed, do you think they should go to prison?
It's for the police to decide and the Criminal Prosecution Service to decide whether charges are brought. And obviously it will be, if charges are brought and those go to court, then the outcome of that court case will determine. I think what is important is that justice is done. I think we need to identify if there has been criminal behaviour that rightly leads to criminal charges. And of course, whatever sentence, if those criminal charges are found, people are found to be guilty, then whatever sentence is appropriate should be applied.
And finally, Prime Minister, I'd like to ask you one more question, if I may. Families of the bereaved and survivors get asked the justice question all the time. What does justice look like to you?
It's very difficult because if you're somebody who has lost your family, lost your loved ones, lost everything you possess, it must look very difficult to see how you can ever really feel justice. To me, when I talk about justice, it's about identifying what happened, it's about getting to the truth, and it's about ensuring that those who were responsible are held to account and properly held to account.
Prime Minister, thank you for taking the time to speak to Grenfell Speaks today. Thank you.
Thank you.